A little spoiler warning for both Dune Part 1 and Part 2.
Somebody help me, please. It's coming. It's the unholy war spreading across the universe like unquenchable fire. A warrior religion that waves the Atreides banner in my father's name. Fanatical legions worshipping at the shrine of my father's skull. A war in my name!
Atreides, strength and humility. Harkonnen, mighty and cruel. Bene Gesserit, wisdom that's all-seeing yet detached. Arrakis, Dune, resourceful, spiritual, deadly. Paul does not become the Mahdi foretold by the prophecy by any arbitrary means, rather because he is the centerpiece of the web that connects all of these worlds and identities, a result of specific calculated choices made by powerful individuals who set his fate in motion. But there was a time when Paul was none of those things, or at least he didn't know about these things. In the same way that at the beginning of Denis Villeneuve's Dune saga, most audiences came in not knowing anything, like me. Seeing Dune Part 1 when it came out in 2021 was my first exposure to this world. And maybe it was the novelty of it all, but the way Part 1 was constructed and the way that it explored various themes and dimensions within its characters, that was something I felt I missed out on in Part 2. But more in Part 2 later. I want to get into what made Part 1 so great for me. Denis Villeneuve's Dune saga ends with a holy war that's supposed to kill millions. But it all starts with Paul getting lectured by his mom. Probably the most universal experience any movie could have started with.
If you want it, make me give it to you.
These few lines seem mundane, but they're packed with information about these two characters. Paul's unconcealed reluctance hints at both a tendency to resist customs and an affinity for rebellion.
Why do we have to go through all this when it's already been decided?
His candidness here also shows that he feels comfortable expressing himself to his mother, despite how stern she may be in the moment. All of this in a few lines that were just meant to inform us about the big ceremony happening soon.
Father wants you in full dress before the Emperor's herald arrives.
But we see pretty quickly how Lady Jessica maintains disciplinary authority over her son. She doesn't like that her only response to his refractory question is ceremony.
Ceremony?
So to maintain control, she immediately commands him to use the voice.
Use the voice.
Notice how the editor drags out this moment by cutting to objects in the room, again serving two purposes: establishing setting as well as building the tension and forcing us to wait to discover what this thing called the voice is. Look at the intensity in their eyes when they look at each other. This is not any casual training regimen. These are not the eyes of a son that does cardio with his mom side by side on some treadmills in the garage. There's clearly a greater purpose here that undermines the relationship of parent and child. Yet again, Jessica's undermined by Paul. He catches her completely off guard. Look at how cutting ahead of time creates an effect of her losing control over her mind. She tries to play it off to protect her dignity and authority over Paul, but he clearly doesn't buy it. And yet, he listens to her. He's still young. The underpinnings of what becomes a monumental power struggle, though, between mother and son, the foundation for a conflict occurring all the way in Dune Part 2, it all starts right here, not even 5 minutes into Part 1. But regardless, Paul's able to win these two exchanges, and he gets out of this first scene victoriously by telling a lie.
More dreams?
No.
I'm not going to bore you with close analysis of every scene, but they're all double-edged swords in the same way. Every scene both delivers exposition while still building character dynamics. We learn about Arrakis and the Fremen through Paul's studying, but we can also note that he's doing it totally alone and sheltered. These virtual projections taking the place of any genuine experience. We watch as control of Arrakis is passed to Duke Atreides, Paul's father, in this massive ceremony, but the stares of each of the attendees are drawn out to create tension. Why are none of them smiling in this supposedly celebratory transfer of power? Who is she? How does she know Jessica? But the key to these moments is that we don't know anything that Paul doesn't know. And in doing so, we become connected to Paul, aligned with his hero's journey. New study material, new responsibilities for his family, new fears for the people he cares about who are sent to venture into unguarded territory. Paul's life is changing, and we're dropped into the middle of it with him. It's effective because we, the audience, and Paul, the character, share the fact that we have no idea what's going to happen. Things are moving slowly, and the world of Dune is only slightly framing the edges for us as the viewers. But the tension that comes out of the unknown is what maintains our attention. This scene demonstrates what I'm talking about best, and it might be my favorite scene out of both films. I know it's maybe a tough argument to make when it occurs 25 minutes into a two-part adaptation that lasts over 5 hours, but this scene perfectly demonstrates everything I need and want from these Dune movies. It perfectly builds on top of scene 1. Remember when you thought you got away with that lie, Paul? You little shit son, I am your mother, and I'm going to put you through a trial by fire. I'm ready to let you die.
She would like to meet you.
Why?
She wants to know about your dreams.
How does she know about my dreams?
We're completely, perfectly lined up with Paul's perspective here. Neither of us know what the hell is going to happen when he goes into this room, and we really don't know what's going to happen when he puts his hand in that box. The tension created from the unknown is so gripping and palpable in this scene, a result of very well acted physicality by Chalamet, and then Villeneuve just lets him do what he does best. With the help of a fantastic score, we get our first glimpse of the Lisan al-Gaib. Screw the Wonka crap, this moment is everything. Pain is for simple humans, and Paul is no mere human. The Atreides boy who will grow up and become Muad'Dib, the prophet. If they dropped the ball even a little bit with this scene, which really, if we take a step back, could have happened. It could have looked extremely silly. I mean, he's literally just putting his hand into an empty box. But if they fumbled here at all, Paul's credibility is shattered. His untouchable greatness that eventually unites millions in the desert, this is the scene that lays that foundation. There's still small moments and details that display Paul's humanity and adolescence. Here there's childlike glee in the way that he runs up and hugs Duncan, and here there's a kindness that is evident in him when he talks to this man watering the sacred palm trees. But all of this is now colored against the backdrop of a much darker, inhumane Paul, the roots of which are revealed when he passes the Bene Gesserit test of humanity, the Dom Jabbar. Part 1 does such a beautiful job of juxtaposing these two sides of Paul, creating what I consider to be the centerpiece of Villeneuve's Dune adaptation. Paul's struggle to maintain the side of his humanity in light of the side of his fate. Paul finally becomes aware of his fate after he learns of the plans that led to his father's death here in the tent after he and his mother escape.
That's the future. It's coming.
He confronts his fate for the first time, resulting in a rage that's directed at his mother. And subconsciously, Paul's anger at his mother is not really that misdirected. He's angry with the choices that were made by the greater powers that happened over his head, many of which were made by his mother Jessica. She is directly responsible for the fate that Paul can't escape. If the Bene Gesserits were responsible for laying the seeds of Lisan al-Gaib in Arrakis, Jessica is the specific Bene Gesserit who made sure Paul's identity and path aligned with how those seeds eventually took root. She was the one who chose to have a son, chose to teach him the voice, and tears him away from Duncan's sacrifice to keep them alive. She was the one who set Paul on this path and kept him alive far enough to make it there. So of course at the end of the film, she's the one that Paul has to kill Jameis in order to protect. Again, showing that Jessica's the one who represents his inescapable fate. She is eventually the force that makes Paul drink the water of life, the final step in him ascending and embracing his Lisan al-Gaib status. Paul's fate has always and always will be determined by Jessica. And of course, the other half of Paul, the side that seeks to maintain his humanity, is none other than the other half of his genetic makeup, his father.
I want you sitting in on my council. Learn what I do.
What if I'm not Dad? I'm the future of House Atreides.
I told my father I didn't want this either. I wanted to be a pilot.
You never told me that.
And if your answer is no, you'll still be the only thing I ever needed you to be. My son.
After Leto's death, Paul's humanity becomes linked to Chani, who shows him kindness by providing him a blade for the duel. There's an immediate connection between Paul and Chani. She's the girl who he sees in his dreams, and she emerges as one of the primary reasons Paul continues to follow in the footsteps of his late father to try and join the Fremen as an equal.
We'd be no better than Harkonnens.
No. By making an alliance with the Fremen.
Paul needs to get off world. You must have ways. You have smugglers, you have ships,
No.
you have...
The Emperor sent us to this place. And my father came. Not for spice, not for the riches, but for the strength of your people. My road leads into the desert.
Part 1 concludes here with the foundation of this ultimate power struggle that will come between Jessica and Chani, fate and humanity, set up perfectly for Part 2 to delve deeper into this dilemma and explore deeper nuance within these two sides. With the roots set in place at the end of Part 1, the ball starts rolling in Part 2 as soon as Paul and Jessica reach the Fremen stronghold. Watch what happens after they walk in. Do you notice anything different about it, about this scene, compared to everything from Part 1? Remember, throughout Part 1, everything was told specifically through Paul's perspective. Everything we knew and did not know was linked with what Paul knew and did not know. But these moments are now linked with a separate perspective that is still in the same space as Paul. The camera lingers on someone new. These moments with Stilgar when he brings Paul and Jessica into the Fremen community and when he consults with the elders is a shift to Stilgar's perspective, a type of shift we're not super used to seeing yet in this Dune adaptation. And what Stilgar knows and what we know as the audience is not aligned at all. Lisan al-Gaib is his faith and his guiding light, but we as the audience are only now starting to see the first few hints of what the prophecy is and represents for him and the other Fremen. Now you might say, well, part 2 has already seen a separate perspective, a long time ago when the entire film started with Princess Arulan narrating her diary. But this is still consistent with part 1, where we would often leave Paul's perspective occasionally for scenes happening on other worlds, specifically moments with the Harkonnen. But now, characters that are within Paul's immediate vicinity have split off into their own development within the plot of part 2. I'm talking about Stilgar, but also Jessica and Chani. Again, Jessica and Chani have been set up in part 1 for their characters in part 2 to represent different outcomes of Paul's life, and this becomes very apparent at the end of part 2, when Chani is clearly opposed to Jessica's involvement in making Paul drink the water of life. And then when the movie ends, they're the last two that we see. Jessica, victorious, watching over the fruits of her labor. Chani, who's defecting, broken and defeated. But how is this actually set up through the earlier part of the film? How does Dune Part 2 bridge the gap between the ending of the previous film and its own ending? My argument is that it doesn't. It kind of fails to do so because everything becomes overshadowed by this idea of the prophecy. What's tricky about adapting the prophecy is that the prophecy by nature is this detached, cerebral concept. It's ingrained into the minds of the masses, but it's not really something that you can tangibly show. And though the first 2 acts of Dune 2 are centered around a gradual acceptance of the prophecy by specific individuals, Stilgar, Jessica, Chani, and Paul himself, I would argue what's more important to the narrative is the acceptance by the masses. After all, they're the ones who mobilize to help Paul take the throne in the climax. But it's very difficult to show this latter part. I mean, how do you convey on screen the fact that an entire society is shifting its mindset? In part 2, Villeneuve chooses to show this shift by showcasing critical moments in Paul's growth with the Fedaykin. There's this moment where they admire his humility after Jessica drinks the water of life, then a test of his survival instincts in the desert by himself, then a moment where he's fighting colonizers with them, and finally, the test to ride the Shai-Hulud. And that's kind of the crux of my problem with Dune Part 2 right there. For too long, everything that happens in the film is simply a reaction to Paul's role within the prophecy. In Part 1, we had numerous character and plot developments that were happening all over. Assassination schemes, a mother testing her son, warriors exploring Arrakis, a doctor betraying the family that he serves. Now in Part 2, it's flipped. There's only one main plot development, Paul becoming more ingrained into Fremen society. And though we get to see the diverse perspectives of Stilgar, Jessica, and Chani, these perspectives become bland and distilled as they're shaped around just this one single idea. Because of that, this new form of exposition in Part 2 feels so much thinner and less interesting to me. Another way of putting this is that Paul has way too much plot armor in this movie. Paul is never really struggling. His transition into Fremen life is very smooth, almost too smooth. The Fedaykin have a certain way of fighting. Oh yeah, Paul fits right in. He has to choose a name. Of course he chooses Muad'Dib, something humble yet incredibly wise. He has to ride the Shai-Hulud. Of course he calls a grandfather worm, the biggest they've ever seen. I get that this is the whole point of the prophecy, but the sheer convenience and ease by which he accomplishes all of this, it just makes everyone's reactions to it very one-dimensional. Of course, visually, Villeneuve and the cinematographer Greg Fraser and the rest of their team do a fantastic job of keeping things visually entertaining. But narratively, I just wasn't that impressed. I mean, I think there's a bit of a problem when Paul straightening his leg is framed as a big narrative moment in the film. Like, why is this the first time we get to hear this awesome needle drop again from Part 1? What's also frustrating is that massive moments that alter the direction of the plot feel oversimplified. The Harkonnen airships essentially nuke the North, taking out the entire home of the Fremen in the North. The film barely spends 5 minutes on this. Why? Because again, it's all meant to relate back to the same idea, that Paul has to embrace his role of joining the South and leading them as their prophet. A decision that he has put off for so long, a decision that hangs in the balance of the relationship with the woman he loves, a decision that the entire film has been building towards, and it's a decision that he makes after essentially just touching the ground. Like, are you kidding me? This is what everything was building towards? Yes, he goes to the South, drinks the water of life, and becomes this incredible prophet, don't get me wrong. Timothée Chalamet's performance in the last 30 minutes of this film is absolute chef's kiss, but I hate how Chani's character feels so helpless. What was supposed to be a power struggle between her and Paul's mother, between fate and humanity, becomes this one-sided beatdown by fate on the side of humanity. I'm not interested in Chani standing while everyone else kneels. This is not a particularly nuanced depiction of her mental state and the side that she stands for. I want to see the influence that she could have had earlier over the situation as Paul's love, as his closest confidant, but she's completely excluded from the critical decisions that he makes, and she ends up serving as a powerless bystander in all all of this. So heartbreaking to see Zendaya play this headstrong girl who is able to see past the mindless masses, only to be snuffed out of every critical decision towards the end of the film. She doesn't lose any kind of struggle. She just wasn't ever given a chance. Her love, her livelihood, and her people are all taken away from her, and the assumption is that she didn't care until she got to stand up when everyone else is sitting down and listening. I didn't realize Dune Part 2 was about boys trying to impress their middle school crush by ignoring the teacher. Sit down, Chani, or else I'm gonna make you move your clip from green to red. Honestly, I really think Zendaya is underutilized in this film. I think what would have potentially have worked better for me is if Dune Part 2 was going to change perspectives anyways, then it should have fully committed. What if we had seen everything from Chani's perspective? Because if the prophecy is so powerful, if the Lisan al-Gaib is really Paul's destiny, then there's really no tension in framing the story around a bunch of people pretending they don't know what's going to happen to Paul. Like, bro, I already know. There's no unknown, there's no tension from this. But what is still very interesting is Chani's struggle to fight for Paul's love and to fight to protect herself and her people. When Paul starts to show signs of change, how does she engage with his thoughts and his progression? What is her relationship with her people? With this woman who seems to be her friend, with Stilgar? Who are her direct family, and why did they name her Deserteers? What attracts her to Paul, and why did they even become in love in the first place? Besides this empty promise from Paul that he will only ever love her. There's so many dimensions to Chani's involvement in the development of the plot and the development of Paul's character, and so much of it is totally unexplored. Why does she only appear after he's made the decisions that he's made? Why is she relegated to being a reactant to everything? It would be so much more interesting and heartbreaking to see her fight to be an active role in all of these developments, only to lose anyways to fate. If the argument is that the film is already almost 3 hours long and that there's no time for this, then I'd argue just cut the first 40 minutes of the film. We don't have to be spoon-fed a sped up and abbreviated version of Paul assimilating into Fremen society. He already told us he was going to do that at the end of the last film.
My road leads into the desert.
So start the film after he's already assimilated and drop us into the middle of the North being attacked, when Paul and Chani have to figure out whether to move south and risk Paul becoming a prophet. If the film can then utilize Chani's perspective, it can embrace the success of how the first film just dropped us into Paul's perspective. In the same way that our perspective was grounded in Paul's reactions to the millions of things happening around him in Part 1, our perspective in Part 2 can be grounded in Chani's as her entire world is shattered, as Paul slowly does become a prophet as they move south. And at least we can have a more complex process for this crucial moment in the narrative when Chani and Paul do decide to go south. The current version has Chani being incredibly stern, saying,
He's afraid of the fundamentalists, and he should be.
yeah, you better not go south. You better be scared of what could happen. And then 2 minutes later, they're caressing each other and she's telling him he can do whatever he wants. Like, I gotta be able to touch this ground with my girlfriend. I want that for myself.
What?
In my opinion, Part 2 should have been this harrowing, horrifying progression as Paul starts to brainwash and lead all of these people to their deaths for his own personal vengeance. Chani is a great perspective to showcase that. Instead, it becomes this anime setup and payoff with a ton of filler and then an amazing speech by Paul before he has this incredible duel. Like, let's be real, he looks super sick in this speech, but he's not supposed to be a hero. He's a dark anti-hero who's been completely corrupted. I wish the takeaway had been a lot darker and more complicated. I don't know. Maybe I'm totally out of my element here as somebody who is relatively new to the story and world of Dune, but given how much I loved Part 1, I really thought Part 2 had so much more to give. The ending right now, the way that it is, when we saw and learned so little about Chani and who she really is, it feels like she's being relegated to an afterthought. What is it like to live in a society where you feel helpless as you watch the politics of the people you love sway towards something you feel deeply opposed to? That's something that I think myself and a lot of people could relate to. If you liked my video, I work super hard on these types of videos, and it would be super great if you could subscribe. Thank you.